Hello everyone and welcome to this year's CommsDay Summit, one that's the circumstances are very different from the normal, but I'm sure that we can get plenty of value out of participating in this year's event. My name's Greg Laverty and I'm a Group Executive with Sunshine Coast Council. The video today is being shot on the Sunshine Coast, which is a location that's traditionally had a reputation as a great place for a holiday, but hasn't necessarily been viewed as a place where someone would think seriously about starting a business. In 2013, Council set about changing that perception of the Sunshine Coast with the adoption of the Regional Economic Development Strategy. The strategy is a 20-year blueprint that has got 4 very ambitious goals included in it. The first of those goals relates to the economic size of the region. The goal is to grow the gross regional product from 13 billion to 33 billion over that 20-year period. In 2013, when the strategy was adopted, the average wage on the Sunshine Coast was 20% below the Queensland average. That's a goal that we hope to rectify, where we look for the average wage on the Sunshine Coast to be higher than the average in Queensland, and one of the ways we're going to do that is by building a significant number, 100,000 to be exact, of high value jobs. And last but not least, we're looking to increase the amount of exports of goods and services from the Sunshine Coast to greater than 20%. At the end of the first year, 5-year action plan, Council is well on the way to achieving those goals, and the Sunshine Coast has developed into one of Australia's key economic growth regions. The regions is one of the 5 that are identified by Infrastructure Australia in its Australia Infrastructure Plan that will be required to underpin the productivity of the Australian economy. Sunshine Coast Council is one of the largest councils in Australia, with an annual budget in excess of $700 million and more than $6 billion worth of assets under management, as well as in excess of 1,800 staff. The organisation has certainly benefited, as has the region, from the amalgamation of the former Caloundra and Maroochy Shire councils that's provided a significantly larger council, that's provided economies of scale, and that has allowed the council to undertake a range of projects and initiatives that has placed the Sunshine Coast region in such a good place that it is today. The economic building blocks for the Sunshine Coast are very strong, with the average annual growth rate of the economy being more than 4% for more than a decade. So that's well in excess of the Australian average, and there's no reason with the projects and initiatives that are underway that this shouldn't continue into the future. There are currently more than 320,000 people living on the Sunshine Coast, and this is forecast to grow to more than 500,000 by 2041. It's worth noting that the Sunshine Coast is part of the southeast Queensland region that stretches from the Sunshine Coast to the Gold Coast, and more than 1 in 7 Australians call that region home. And certainly across that region, the population growth will continue long into the future. Importantly, this population growth is supported by significant private and public sector investment on the Sunshine Coast. You'll see a major projects map that outline a whole range of projects that have been delivered on the Sunshine Coast. It's a very ambitious list of projects, but one that is very much achievable, and there are a number of those projects that have already been delivered or are well underway. In relation to private sector investment, the Sunshine Plaza Retail Centre at Maroochydore has recently seen the completion of a $400 million expansion. The Aura development to the south of Caloundra, which is coming out of the ground, will see 20,000 dwellings, which will accommodate 50,000 people, and that's the largest residential development currently underway in the country. A little further north is the Harmony development that will see 8,000 dwellings, accommodate 17,000 people. So clearly the population growth has been planned, it is occurring in certain areas, and that will minimise the urban sprawl and maintain the outstanding character that the Sunshine Coast is currently recognised for. In addition to these retail and residential investments, there are a range of commercial and other investments that are currently underway or in the pipeline. In relation to public sector investment, Council is developing Council's only Greenfield Development at Maroochydore. This 53 hectare site has had the benefit of being designated a priority development area by the Queensland Government. This designation is significant because of the benefit that the increased planning certainty that it brings. A lot of that planning is already been approved, and obviously any planning certainty and the streamlining of planning approvals is a great incentive. Being a greenfield development, we have the advantage of being able to put infrastructure in the ground in advance. In particular, already in place in stage 1 of that development, fibres that run to every block that is currently under development, and also in place is an underground waste system, the first of its kind in Australia. At the entry to this development is the location for the cable landing station that houses the Sunshine Coast branch submarine cable, and obviously that connectivity from the cable landing station directly into some of those development sites is a really important advantage for a whole range of businesses. The $1.8 billion Sunshine Coast University Hospital was completed in 2017, and this has made a significant contribution to seeing a fundamental change in the Sunshine Coast economy, where health and wellbeing is now the largest employment sector on the Sunshine Coast. This has overtaken the traditional retail, tourism and construction sectors that we have largely relied on for many years in the past. So that change in the structure of the economy is one of the goals of the Regional Economic Development Strategy that we are already seeing start to play out. The Sunshine Coast Airport will have a new international runway that will open in December of this year, which, looking at the current climate, will be very good timing to benefit from what should be a strong rebound from the current circumstances that we're dealing with. Council has traditionally been the owner and operator of that airport, but with the significant expansion plans in place, Council has entered into a 99-year lease with Palisade, and that will give that operation a much stronger commercial focus and allow it to grow into the future. The University of the Sunshine Coast has recently completed expansions in excess of $80 million, both at the Sippy Downs campus as well as the opening of the new campus at the Petrie site in the Moreton Bay Council area to our south. Another example of very strong leadership for Council is that Council has completed the construction and commissioning of a 15 megawatt solar farm, which provides all of Council's electricity needs. And that's in the last financial year, 109% of Council's electricity needs were generated from that solar farm, with the remaining 9% being sold back into the grid. And that's a fantastic achievement, both from a leadership perspective, but also the retail and commercial arrangements associated with that project. While the projects that I've touched on already are some of the largest and very unique projects for a local government, clearly the most unique project that the Council has undertaken is the Sunshine Coast International Broadband Network project. And that submarine cable landing on the Sunshine Coast is the one that would be most relevant from the CommsDay Summit attendees. Initially, Council's focus was to work with ACMA to get a cable protection zone application approved so that we provided some increased certainty for an operator to actually land a cable on the Sunshine Coast. However, in the absence of having a commercial player ready to make that commitment, it was very difficult to try and get that cable protection zone application approved. So Council took a bold decision to invest $35 million to get that branch constructed and provide the necessary landside infrastructure for that cable to land. This $35 million investment for Council is partly offset by a $15 million grant from the Queensland Government, who have been hugely supportive of this project and certainly have indicated a willingness to provide support for future investment attraction activities that Council might undertake to take advantage of that submarine cable landing. Council has secured a partnership with RTI for the landing of that branch, which was delivered by Alcatel Submarine Networks. Importantly, that RTI cable joins the JGA South network that provides connectivity from the Sunshine Coast to Sydney, which is an important domestic connection, but also to Guam, to the United States, and not far behind that, seamless connectivity into Japan, which will be done by the middle of this calendar year, and then not long before that, after that, there will be connectivity into Hong Kong, and then hopefully down the path, not too long in the distant future, we will see connection to Singapore. So why did Council take the opportunity to invest in such a project? The key driver for the project were the economic benefits that Council expected to achieve for the local economy and more broadly to Queensland. In 2017, with funding from the Commonwealth Government, Council engaged GQI to undertake a feasibility study that indicated that the project would bring additional jobs to the Sunshine Coast, as well as stop the leakage of some of the high-value jobs that might be lost to the region without such connectivity existing. The feasibility study identified that the economic benefits for the state of Queensland were estimated at $927 million and included up to 800 jobs directly for the Sunshine Coast over the life of the project. While the cable only achieved ready for service in the past few days, the interest in the project has been rapidly growing in the last few months. There was clearly some scepticism when Council originally started talking about the idea of landing a cable here in 2015, but at certain points in recent months, as the cable has been delivered, there was very good coverage of the Ile de Bret vessel landing the cable on the beach on the 23rd of December, and certainly the announcements around it being ready for service in recent days has seen the interest spark dramatically in recent weeks. Council has also undertaken a range of investment attraction campaigns, predominantly focused on digital platforms that have generated in excess of 1,400 new investment leads. Now, these are mainly around the submarine cable and also the associated improvements in the telecommunication infrastructure in the region. One of those examples that has already played out is the attraction of Huddle Insurance to the Sunshine Coast. So late last year, Huddle Insurance announced that they would establish a presence on the Sunshine Coast. The head office is based in Sydney, but they cited the cable as a real draw card for their business to expand to the Sunshine Coast. Huddle much prefer to be known as a technology company rather than an insurance company, and this is backed by significant use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the use of bots that assess and approve claims in a matter of minutes. Similarly, another Sydney firm set up operations on the Sunshine Coast in the form of Office HQ. Office HQ are a tele-networking company that has again cited improving telecommunications infrastructure on the Sunshine Coast to establish an operation on the Sunshine Coast and then to expand their operations on the Sunshine Coast. In December last year, Office HQ announced that they would put on an additional 40 FTEs on the Sunshine Coast to take their total employment on the Sunshine Coast to 110. The technology that Office HQ operate on allows 90% of their staff to work from home, and that's technology and an arrangement that has become incredibly important in responding to the current COVID-19 circumstance that we face. Local firms have also responded to the opportunities that the landing of the submarine cable presents for the Sunshine Coast. There are multiple local companies who are taking the lead with the construction of new fibre and also new wireless networks around the Sunshine Coast. In some cases, these are connections to individual businesses who are after the international connectivity that is available from the submarine cable, or in some cases simply the improved and greater resilience that's provided by the domestic connection from Maroochydore to Sydney to their customers or to their existing operations. Council is currently in conversations with a number of carriers in relation to connectivity from the cable landing station in Maroochydore being made available to all parts of not only the Sunshine Coast but more broader to the state of Queensland. Downstairs in the cable landing station, there's a meet me room that's got 24 racks available, and that is certainly attracting attention from both carriers and also businesses who want to set up operations on the Sunshine Coast. Similarly, there are companies that are announcing new fibre builds from regional parts of Queensland with a view to connecting directly into the cable landing station at Maroochydore. And again, while the actual submarine cable landing on the Sunshine Coast and providing that international connectivity, capacity, diversity, low latency is really important, the success of that will be generated by the domestic connectivity that has seen quite a lot of interest in recent times. There has also been an international firm who is interested in establishing an operation in Australia, and they are currently looking at the Sunshine Coast as well as 2 capital city options in relation to establishing their businesses. The international connectivity, the low costs, the low operating costs associated with doing business on the Sunshine Coast, the wonderful lifestyle locations are certainly things that are attractive to the Sunshine Coast, as is the fact that there are more than 30,000 small businesses here that are currently underserved in relation to some of those digital services that are available in capital cities at the moment. So the firm will deploy a range of cloud services, both platform and software as a service, that will be really important for the competitiveness of local businesses on the Sunshine Coast. Obviously, now that the submarine cable is ready for service, inquiries around capacity sales have also been received, both to Sydney and internationally, and those sales are currently being led by RTI. And again, with that supporting domestic connectivity, we're hopeful that that strong leads that are coming for that international capacity will continue. As well as individual businesses, the submarine cable opportunity, infrastructure will open up opportunities. We've also seen additional industry pathways that are starting to emerge. In particular, cybersecurity is one that's attracted a lot of interest on the Sunshine Coast since the announcement of the submarine cable. The Sunshine Coast is already home to ID Care, which is an Australia and New Zealand identity and cyber support services, and they offer a range of unique services to individuals and businesses who have had their identities compromised, and they've already helped out thousands of people and businesses who have been unfortunately subject to those breaches. The University of the Sunshine Coast and CQ University both offer programs in cybersecurity, and those types of programs are really important to improve the reputation of the Sunshine Coast in relation to the cybersecurity offering. Over the last month, Council has been approached by a cybersecurity company who has expressed an interest in moving their operations to the Sunshine Coast from another location in Australia. And this is because the cable and the diverse paths, the risk management, business redundancy, as well as international connectivity and latency that are now available direct from the Sunshine Coast, combined with the great lifestyle location that we are. One of the key things that attracted Council to RTI as a partner was the integrated network that their services offered. As I mentioned earlier, there is significant connectivity available from Sunshine Coast to Sydney, which is an important domestic connection, but also to Guam, and there are lots of connectivity options from Guam, and RTI are investing in a facility there that will see even greater connectivity available. Importantly, the RTI network allows seamless connectivity from the Sunshine Coast to Sydney, to the United States, to Japan in the near future, Hong Kong not far behind that, and then down the track a little bit further to Singapore, which is a very attractive option for a range of businesses both on the Sunshine Coast and more broadly Queensland and potentially even the Northern Territory. For the Sunshine Coast right now, there are a couple of things that have happened that mean that we're about to ramp up the activities that are happening. Obviously, the ready for service point in the project is a really important one, and now that traffic is available to go live on that project. The second key thing for us at the moment, you might have read that there were local government elections in Queensland on the weekend, so that means that in the next week or so, Council will come out of caretaker provisions. So while we've been in caretaker provisions, there are a range of restrictions that we have had placed upon us, but now we're coming out the other side of that, and it's an ideal time now to take advantage and have a strong focus on the attraction of businesses and attracting the infrastructure that is in place. Obviously, these are trying and unusual times, but there is no question that connectivity is vitally important in the current circumstances where a lot more people are working remotely. As I mentioned earlier in the CLS, there are currently negotiations underway and draft documents are being discussed about access to the Meet Me room and providing that domestic connectivity. In addition, the attraction of a data centre operator will now become a key focus for Council. Council has undertaken a number of activities in preparation for that work to begin. We've undertaken a survey of local businesses to understand their data centre needs, and certainly Council as a business is very happy to throw our data centre needs into the mix in relation to building the case for a data centre operator to set up on the Sunshine Coast. There is also an option at the moment with the cable landing station having 4 transmission rooms upstairs, obviously the first being occupied by the RTI cable, but there is the ability for a micro data centre that includes up to 45 racks to be established upstairs in some of those empty transmission rooms. Potentially up to 45 racks that would allow a revenue stream to be generated by a data centre operator while they look at a more permanent option or larger scale option to provide a whole range of services for those Sunshine Coast businesses. Obviously, we understand that the building of such a revenue stream would be an important justification for that for that data centre operator to consider the Sunshine Coast as a site. There are a range of options for the location of that data centre, including a site right next to the cable landing station, but there are also other sites available in some of the industrial areas around the Sunshine Coast or potentially even the hinterland. And obviously with the cable landing station and that site in the priority development area, there are those planning advantages that I referenced earlier. As I said at the start, the Sunshine Coast has long held a great reputation as a fantastic place for a holiday. But now it's very much an attractive place to start, expand or relocate a business. It's still a wonderful lifestyle region, only an hour's north of a capital city in Brisbane. There is significant private and public sector investment occurring. There is a very supportive local government entity on the Sunshine Coast in the Sunshine Coast Council, and there will continue to be strong population growth on the Sunshine Coast. Connectivity is the key, both from a transport perspective with the Sunshine Coast Airport new runway opening in December this year, and from a communication perspective with the landing of the Sunshine Coast International Broadband, as well as the domestic connections that are currently in negotiations. It's not very often that you have a fantastic lifestyle location with all those things together. So certainly I hope that you don't forget about the Sunshine Coast when you start to make future business and investment decisions. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to providing more information on the Sunshine Coast and my best wishes in these challenging times.